Okay, today's warm-up joke involves literature's most famous detective, as you can see, Sherlock Holmes. And the story is as follows, that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were on a camping trip. And in the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes wakes Dr. Watson up. And as they're lying on the grass, Sherlock Holmes says, "Dr. Watson, look up. What do you see?" "Well, I see stars, Holmes." "No, but what are the implications of that? As a detective, what do you deduce?" "Well, I would have to say that there are thousands of galaxies and millions of stars. Astronomically. Astrologically, I would say that Leo is aligned with Taurus. Chronologically, I would say that it's about 3 a.m. in the morning. And meteorologically, I would say that it will be a fine and sunny day tomorrow." And Sherlock Holmes looks at him and says, "Watson, you're a complete idiot. People think you're one of the greatest detectives in the world, but you missed the most important implication of all. The most important implication of all is that someone has stolen our tent." Which is a long way of saying, don't neglect the obvious. I'm going to present to you one of the most obvious facts in economics. And in order to study this, you have to study this week's author. You have to study John Locke. And it's politically unfashionable to study authors like John Locke because he is a terrible thing. John Locke is a dead white man. And in a lot of universities, there is rebellion against studying people like Shakespeare. But I argue you really have to, because of this chart. This chart is one of the essential mysteries of development policy and economic history. Because this chart is an attempt to track average incomes over the last 2,000 years. It's based on data from something called the Angus-Madison Project. And I should stress that calculating average incomes over such a long time period is very inexact. And what they try to do is they try to measure through historical records how much food people consumed at different ages. So often they measure incomes in terms of a wheat equivalent or a corn equivalent, and then they try to convert it back into dollars. And so they have this here, $3 dollars for the year 1990. And the bold black line is the average income for the United Kingdom. And as you can see, something different started happening around the year 1500, possibly earlier. The British income started to take off. When we get to the year 1900, the British average income is 9 times the average income of China and India. For the first 1,000 years of the Common Era, the UK, the world, China, and India were all about the same, about $400 to $500 per year, the current poverty line by some estimates. All we could do was get enough food to feed ourselves, if we were lucky. In bad years, we might have a famine. But then this happened, this takeoff happened, and we need to explain it if we're going to have any hope of explaining how the current third world countries can become developed. And so we need to start looking at what was going on for the UK. Another interesting thing to note is, during approximately the same period, over the last 500 years, you will have noticed that the English speakers have been guilty of the greatest land grab in history. It started, the British Isles, in the year 1500, they controlled 241,000 square miles. It was 1/5 of 1% of the world's land area. But by the time we get up to the period covered by development economics, when the OECD is set up in the 1960s, the English speakers have now expanded to 1/5 of the world's land area. You add the land of the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, it's about 1/5 of the world's land surface. Now, there are a lot of other countries that were trying to do this, the Spanish and the French, but these are the only countries which originally belonged to the OECD. That's a club of developed nations. So what was it about this process that allowed them to export And I'm going to try to give you some answers to that question this morning. Let me ask you a politically controversial question. Is colonization right if it leads to development? Give me red for no, blue for yes. Is it right if it leads to development? No abstentions. No abstentions. Give me a vote. Hazik, give me a vote. Rip off your slip of paper. I think it's almost. I think it's about 60-40 blue. I think it's 60-40 blue. Okay, Sherman, give me a vote. It looks like it's Magdalene. You don't have a piece of paper? Okay. Well, the point I'm making is, I mean, of course it's wrong morally. Of course it's wrong morally. But we have to consider the question, are we looking at this in descriptive terms or prescriptive terms? Let me tell you, if English speakers need to colonize in the year 2014 to create development, it's not going to happen. We just had a colony. I'm an American citizen. We just had a colony in Iraq for 10 years. And it was very painful and bloody, and I don't think we created a stable, developed country as a result. So I'm not talking about prescribing future policy. I'm not talking about what's right. I'm saying we need to describe what happened in the past in a morally neutral way. So it's always been a land grab. It's always been wrong. But there was something about the features of development that are worth trying to explain. Or how about this? This is a controversial question for people from mainland China. The Opium War. In the Opium War of 1839 to 42, the population of China was over 400 million. The population of the UK was 27 million. But the British Navy defeated the Chinese Navy. It was largely a naval war. Do you believe this was due to technological differences or cultural political differences? Give me red for technology, blue for political culture. The red for technology, blue for, I think this is about 50-50. It's about, so if you think the British won the naval battles, you would say red for technology or blue for politics and culture. Well, okay, you can put your cards down. I think both answers are correct. I think both answers are correct, but I think this came first. Because after all, China had some very advanced technology. In the era when Zheng He, Admiral Zheng He, am I pronouncing it correctly, had this huge fleet, they had some of the most advanced ships in the world, but they didn't adopt that technology consistently. And in fact, possibly, John Locke predicted something like this would happen. John Locke predicted that if the legal culture and political culture of the country rewarded industry, that what would happen? That will quickly become to the prince who shall secure protection and encouragement to the honest industry of mankind against the oppression of power and narrowness of party will quickly be too hard for his neighbors. In other words, this sort of country, if it protects industry, will become very powerful. And that's in effect what happened in Western Europe. Often the power was used sinfully. Often it was used for land grab. But they at least had the power to either develop, create a welfare state, or to create a military power. So how does this fit together? I want to say morally, I'm going to be speaking a lot about colonization, and I agree with this statement. This is the Australian Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who went to the Aborigines, and he said bluntly, we did the murders. Sorry, guys. So I'm not claiming in any way this is morally acceptable, but I'm saying we still have to study the phenomenon. And it is more true of the British than any of the other European colonizers that the British, in some way or another, managed to move their whole economic system overseas, whereas the French are now highly developed, but French North Africa is now not highly developed. The Spanish colonized Latin America, but Latin America is now not highly developed. And arguably, the Spanish themselves only achieved it when they joined the European Union. So what is the necessity? What do you need ultimately to have peace? What's the big first step? Adam Smith said this very famous quote, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice." And the first one one is peace. The English managed to achieve internal peace, and that was one of the things that John Locke really contributed to. And this is an old quote from the 18th century, but look at this quote. This is from the year 2006. Paul Collier is probably the top development economist in the world. I think this book is taken much more seriously than Jeffrey Sachs's book, The End of Poverty. And he said that of the bottom billion, the poorest 1 billion people on planet Earth, 73% of them are caught in the conflict trap. And as you'll notice, that the cover of his book shows an African child with a machine gun. So countries that are caught in the conflict trap never get on the escalator at all to become developed countries. Well, how did John Locke contribute to this? Yep. The conflict trap is the idea that certain countries are systematically caught in civil wars, internal conflict or religious persecution. I think he defines it as wars where at least 1,000 people must have been killed. So it's more than just a crime wave. So the country, if it doesn't achieve internal peace, will never be able to start the development process. And John Locke contributed two ideas to this, and he actually started two revolutions. There was a revolution in England in 1688 called the Glorious Revolution, which was England's last revolution, Great Britain's last revolution, and then nearly 100 years later, he instituted the American Revolution, where the Americans rebelled against the British. And in this earlier revolution, he said things like, the kings do not have the power to take away your property or to dictate your religion. And from 1688, the British kings and queens have not tried to seize property arbitrarily or to dictate the religion. But they didn't learn their lesson in the American colonies, because George III tried to do it to the Americans, and the Americans then studied John Locke and said, hey, we have an excuse to rebel. And so they rebelled against the British, and they quoted John Locke heavily when they rebelled against the British. So, give me a vote on this. Do you believe the state should be neutral with respect to different religions? Give me red for yes, no, or blue for yes. The state should be neutral with respect to different religions. Okay, I think that's like a 97% vote for blue. So blue is neutral towards different religions. Okay. Let's consider this. Hollywood often portrays Muslims as being the bad guys in this context. In this time period, religious intolerance in England was heavily associated with the Spanish Inquisition and with this torture. So this is an example of a torture wheel used during the Spanish Inquisition, and religious persecutors were associated with using instruments like this to compel people to a particular way of thinking. And Locke wrote in the reading, care of souls cannot belong to the civil magistrate because his power consists only in outward force. And he goes on to write that religion, whether you accept Islam or Christianity or Buddhism, it's about your inner thoughts, and therefore this cannot have a proper effect. Here's a group of people, a group of Muslims in the western part of Burma who are habitually persecuted, and they're habitually pushed out into Bangladesh. And this woman who's recently been widowed in the persecution, this is a poorly filmed BBC interview. I don't know if you could hear the translation, but she's saying that the police themselves were shooting at the Muslim villagers, and that the army was just watching from the rooftops. So we'll go from a case where the Muslims are the victims of the persecution to a case where they're the perpetrators. This is actually a clip from Al Jazeera generally thought to be reasonably pro-Muslim. So these issues of religious conflict are very much part of development in 2014. There are parts of Nigeria where just you can't send in aid workers because of this. If you look at the news stories about Turkey and Egypt over the last year, a lot of the demonstrations and the riots seem to involve a dispute about the borderline between the power of the state and the power of religion. So if, as Paul Collier writes, 73% of the world's poorest billion people are caught in this poverty trap, this conflict trap, then ending religious conflict is part of the solution to development policy. So here we are back in the 1680s, and a very specific thing happened. This is an illustration of Archbishop Cranmer being burned at the stake by Queen Mary. So Queen Mary was a Catholic queen who came after Henry VIII, and Cranmer was associated with Protestantism, so she got the unhappy name Bloody Mary because she burned so many Protestants. And I'm sure she liked vodka and tomato juice as well, but it's mainly her persecution. And then, horror of horrors, in the 1680s, a new king comes, James II. You probably have never heard of him, but you've heard of the city named after him. New York City was named after him because he was the Duke of York. And when the English invaded New York City, it was named after him. And so there was a lot of fear that persecution in mainland Europe would come to Britain. And so this is the time period when John Locke is writing the letter concerning toleration. He just basically separates the power of the state from religious power and let people decide for themselves. So, and I want to stress, if you have to be Roman Catholic, I don't want to get at you personally. This just happens to be the state of England in the 1680s. There were other cases where the Protestants were the persecutors. So in New England, in America, the Puritans burned witches, and in the city of Geneva in Switzerland, there were cases where the Protestants were the persecutors. So in this time period, virtually every religious group persecuted somebody else at one time or another. So what was the Spanish Inquisition? Let me get my two volunteers who I spoke to earlier. This was actually part of the official scene up until the 1830s. The Spanish Inquisition technically went on till the 1830s. This is one illustration of how we would people would be persuaded to accept the orthodoxy of the Roman Catholic Church, and parts of the Catholic world outside of Europe were sometimes affected by this. So this is technically called the Strapado, S-T-R-A-P-A-D-O. The person, is that nice and tight? Are you going anywhere? Okay, well, apply some upward pressure. I mean, don't break any bones, but your hands should be more straight, I think. Okay, so here's how this worked. So I've just invented a new religion. I've just invented a new religion which I call Scientological Transcendental Dianetics. How do you feel about my new religion? Oh, what a pity. I thought we were going to have a little experiment So it was specifically to avoid the fear of this that the Glorious Revolution happened. So what happened in the Glorious Revolution is that a group of Protestant nobles, they persuaded a Dutch king and queen, Queen Mary and King William, to invade England from Holland, from the Netherlands, and they defeated James II, and so James II had to abdicate, had to leave England, and that was the last real revolution that's happened in the UK. So what did John Locke say about people who weren't Christians? The section of the book that I gave you, the very first 3 pages, only concerned Christians, but if you read a bit further, he said this: all the rights and franchises that belong to him as a man are to be inviolably to be preserved to him. No violence nor injury is to be offered to him, whether he be Christian or pagan. So they understood pagans to be Jews, Muslims, whoever happened to be in the borders of the UK should have the same property rights, civil rights as everyone else. And that was one of John Locke's 2 contributions to the concept of internal peace. The other one was this. He established rules which said when it was okay to rebel against the government. And he said, certainly this is not to be done lightly, and he said, government is very important. In the state of nature, where there are no courts, no judges, we'll all be fighting each other, and he said this: whoever lays the foundation for overturning the constitution and frame of any just government is highly guilty of the greatest crime. So he didn't say you can rebel in all circumstances. He listed a set of circumstances where it's okay to start a rebellion. And why should he argue that we have rights at all? He argued that we should have rights because of the concept of the state of nature. And previously, probably the most famous English philosopher who talked about the state of nature was not John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, who said, the state of nature is so terrible, we'll be fighting each other, it will be a war of all against all. We need a strong king to save us from the state of nature, and for it's evil to rebel against the king, and the king provides law and order, and just suck it up. Well, he didn't say suck it up, but he said accept it because it's better to have order than disorder. And John Locke has another state of nature argument. He said, yes, we could be in disorder because of the state of nature, but he said, what do we look like in the state of nature? In the state of nature, I'm roughly as powerful as you, and you're roughly as powerful as the next person. We have roughly equal physical abilities, and therefore, in the state of nature, we should treat each other as equals. And we've created this system of government to serve our needs and interests as equals. And furthermore, he says that God created us as equals. So, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which teaches that all mankind, being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possession. Even the king, if the king wants to take your farm away, or even the king, if the king wants to take your jewelry collection away, does not have the right to harm you in your possessions, because we're all created equal. So, let's consider the origin of this argument by looking at a different question. Let's consider this natural law question. Suppose that you were suffering from a painful terminal disease, some form of cancer, and you know it's terminal. Should the law forbid you from killing yourself? No, the law should not forbid you. Blue, the law should forbid you. Okay? Give me a vote, give me a vote. Blue, the law should the law okay, so red, you allow suicide. Blue, the law should prevent you from killing yourself. Okay, well, I'll tell you what John Locke would vote. I'll tell you what John Locke would vote. John Locke believes that you don't have the right to kill yourself because you didn't create yourself. John Locke said this: for men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, they are his property, made to last during his, not one another's pleasure. So if you take this argument and other quotes from the book, then don't own ourselves. We don't have the right to commit suicide because we are the result of divine workmanship. There's a technical term for this type of argument. This type of argument tries to look at the underlying cause of things, and from the Greek word meaning telos, for purpose, this is a teleological argument. So he believes that you can look at the law of nature. He argues the same thing about homosexuality. He says about sodomy, because men and women seem designed to create babies, therefore sex between two men is not right because it seems to not fit in with what he considers to be a natural law. That again is a teleological argument. Now in this case it happens to go along with believing in a God, so Jews and Christians and Muslims will all probably agree on this logic, but there are some teleologists who aren't Christians, like Aristotle. What would Bentham have said? Probably Bentham would say that it's okay to commit suicide if it leads to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. If the terminally ill person is really, really suffering, and you're going to reduce the amount of suffering by allowing that person to commit suicide, then possibly suicide itself, or even possibly assisted suicide, which is legal, I believe, in parts of Switzerland, would be okay. And of course, utilitarians, they don't believe in a law of nature. Bentham did not believe in a divine creator, so when he reads John Locke talking about natural rights, he says this is rubbish. He says that natural rights are nonsense upon stilts. There are no rights. You just evaluate what is going to help people based on the greatest good of the greatest number. So how does government come about? In the state of nature, there would be constant conflict. There's no common judge, as we saw from the reading, to rescue you from that constant conflict. So Locke wrote, to take away all such mutual grievances, injuries, and wrongs, such as attend men in the state of nature, there was no way but ordaining some kind of government. So, but look at the process. The process is very interesting because he's assuming that a group of equal people, I have to say he said men, I'm sorry ladies, he doesn't use gender-neutral language, but equal beings create the government for their convenience. Where other philosophers like Thomas Hobbes had said, well, you just have to put up with the king who might be very dictatorial, but that's the best you can hope for, and so therefore just accept whatever strong authority you get from the center. But Locke is saying, no, mankind, human beings decided that government was a good idea, and they decided when they were in a state of equality. And therefore, this thing which they decided upon, which they ordained when they were in a state of equality, must be convenient for them. It must be something which makes that contract, that decision to create government, logical. So once the government existed, he had a whole list of things that justified rebelling against the government. So Charles II and James II, the kings before the Glorious Revolution, they were accused of interfering with elections. They were accused of preventing Parliament from meeting for long periods of time. They were accused of arbitrarily taking away your property. And so in the final chapter of the two treatises, John Locke says, these are things that allow you to rebel against the government. And he's rather sarcastic about another philosopher called Berkeley, who says in this situation you can rebel against the government, but you must rebel in a respectful way. You must rebel in a reverent way. You know, how exactly, and he says this is very difficult to understand what this means. I mean, you know, you're stabbing the king, you're cutting his head off with a block, but you're being very respectful about it. It doesn't seem to make sense. You know, once you decide that the king is a dictator, a tyrant, a murderer, you just fight. And you get rid of the king, and you bring in another king. Where do you think he was when he was writing the two treatises? Do you think he was in England? No, he was hiding in an attic somewhere, at times in Germany and at times in Holland. So this was a very dangerous thing to write, and even after the Glorious Revolution, there are copies of the two treatises which were published anonymously. So if James II could have found him, he would have put his head on a pike on the Tower of London. You know, this was a very dangerous thing to write at the time. So, this doctrine of a power in the people, where the legislators have acted contrary to their trust by invading their property, is the best defense against rebellion. And historically, this seems to be true. He's saying that if you create a government which protects property, it's going to be a stable government, there's going to be an end of rebellions. And that's largely true. Since 1688, there have been no more revolutions in England. The Constitution has changed little by little, but that was the last revolution. In the United States, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, roughly the same system of government has carried on for about 200 years. In France, however, they've had multiple revolutions. They're on the Fifth Republic. It's called the Fifth Republic of France. They've had multiple revolutions and 5 separate democracies leading up to the current one. So here we have a picture of an amputee, a child who's lost his leg in Angola because of the landmine in Angola. So this is the sort of thing, I would argue, from development policy that Locke's principles could prevent. If you just decide that the only way to change your government is through an election, and you allow religious tolerance, it should be the end to civil war. But we don't have that. As mentioned earlier, 73% of the world is caught in this conflict trap. So now we come to property. Suppose that an English farmer in the 1680s decides to go to America. Do they have a right to set up farms on land Native American tribes are using for hunting? So red, no, they don't have the right to take away the land, and yes, blue for yes. So red, you don't have the right to take away the land they're using for hunting. Red, they don't have the right to take away the land. So can I ask why? Why would you vote that way? But they're hunter-gatherers. They hunt buffalo. One year the buffalo were there, and the next year the buffalo aren't there. I mean, it's So let's suppose it's the year 1840, and your great-great-great-grandfather has come from China to Singapore, and he sets up a shop house. And the year earlier, a Malay person was using it for something else. Was that immoral? Okay. It's a vexed issue. I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer either way. In fact, John Locke was heavily involved in making laws for America. He never set foot in America, but he was part of a corporation that was seeking to develop Carolina, what is now North and South Carolina, and some of the land around it. And he wrote this thing called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. So they were debating this very actively, and the British and the Dutch had a different policy. The British basically more or less said, if you can grab the land, then grab the land. The Dutch said you had to buy it from somebody. So there was this very famous incident, which American school children read about, that they bought Manhattan Island for $24. And of course, it was actually trade goods worth about 60 guilders. But because the Native Americans, the Indians, didn't have a fixed settlement, the transaction was probably baffling to them. I mean, we don't live in any one place all year round. So the idea that these white people from Holland come and give you, axe handles and seashells to have Manhattan Island, just, I'm sure, was not comprehensible to them. So Locke has this argument. Locke has this argument that the ownership of property should be linked to the labor that creates the property. So he says this: whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, he has mixed his labor with, and therefore makes it his property. So if you had a great-great-great-grandfather in 1848 who had that shop house, if your ancestor made the shop house, Locke would say, okay, it's your ancestor's property. Or the farmer in Carolina. If he's done the work to create the farm and mixed his labor with it, then he's made it his property. And it's the sort of argument they needed to have because they were in the middle of grabbing a lot of land. And I want to argue that this has had a massive effect on the difference between English overseas development in the Americas and Spanish overseas development. So this is the bar chart showing the percentage of household heads who own land. In the USA in 1900, it's about 3/4. In Canada in 1900, it's even more, 87.1. It looks like the Singapore home ownership rate, actually. What happens in Spanish America? In Mexico, only 2.4% of rural Mexicans own the land. In Argentina, less than 30% own the land, household heads. What happened when the Spanish colonized America is that there were people like the ancestors of the original conquistadors, the generals and the admirals who conquered South America, Central America. They grabbed huge tracts of land and then had them farmed by slaves and tenant farmers. So you get a tiny minority at the top of the pyramid who have all of the power, and then a huge lower pyramid where nobody owns anything and nobody really has secure property rights. So whether or not John Locke directly caused this, or he's just an expression of it, it is true to say that in the white Anglo-Saxon developed countries, where they developed, ownership was very closely tied to labor. The people who did the work on the farm were much more frequently owners, and it makes it much easier to sustain a democracy if this is true. If 87% of the population own land, then a large number of people actually have some power and it's distributed. In Mexico, which has really struggled to create democracy and has only really partially managed it in the last 2 or 3 decades, this makes it very difficult to sustain democracy because all of the power is concentrated at the top. Let's consider this. This is a much more important bar chart for Singapore because Singapore doesn't have much farming. Singapore never had a lot of farming. But this tells you something about the ability to own a business in different areas. So this is the cost of registering a business as a percentage of average income. So this shows that in Singapore, I think it's about 0.5% of annual income is needed to register a business, and this has probably always been true of these countries. In fact, in the United States, there is no law that says you have to register a business at all. You can start a store, a part-time business, and then later on, if you make a profit, it's illegal if you don't pay the tax. But it's not illegal to try. And what is very important from this point of view is that it again distributes power. In countries where you pay 50% of your average income, your income, to register a business, only the rich, only a very small percentage of people at the top of the pyramid ever own anything. And so countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, where it's extraordinarily difficult to own a legal business, you get a divided economy. You get an economy where few people at the top of the pyramid can own the shops in a shopping mall with air conditioning. Everybody else is selling in the squatter village. Whereas this creates a sort of economic democracy, and it's particularly linked to English concepts of development. There were 180 countries measured by the World Bank in 2008. 22 of them had free business registration, which I'll describe as business registration which costs less than 2% of annual income. And about half of those were former British colonies. If the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam wanted to create development and have people really start paying their taxes, this would be a great policy, in my view, free business registration. So again, We don't know enough to say that this is the cause, that John Locke is the cause of this, but he certainly is the expression of it. The idea that the business should be owned by the person working in the shop house or the restaurant or whatever it is. That the ownership of the property should be linked to the labor that creates the property. Do you understand the term business values as opposed to property values, land values, or building values? This person is selling his laundry business on the web. He's selling it for just under 500,000 US dollars, and he doesn't own the building, he doesn't own the land, he advertises it's a lease, and he's just selling the name of the business and maybe the washing machines, and perhaps he's worked for 40 years doing this and he wants to retire, and he can quite legally. There's no business permit that prevents him from selling this. So you could get an annuity and maybe have several $1,000s each year in your retirement because of this. But in countries with business permits, this sort of property does not exist. Business values rarely exist at all because people will say, no, the business permits are personal permits. You can't sell it in your old age because 2 or 3 government officials have to decide to give you permission to sell it. So you don't have the option of realizing the value in your old age. So the freedom to own a business and build a property in a business is a very useful part of development. It's a very Lockean process. I use the adjective Lockean to describe the ideas of John Locke. So here we come back to this line graph. This line graph. How did the British become so developed over this time period? What was unusual about British development since the year 1500? John Locke describes a lot of those differences. He says religious tolerance, peace, stable democratic government, all of these things will tend to produce the first condition, peace, and then finally, labor should be linked to property, and then property should be protected. That wise prince who protects industry will create countries that are too hard for their neighbors. Okay, any questions quickly? We can also go back to them in our small groups. Can I just ask, can I get a show of hands who either has a laptop with Microsoft Word or Word for Mac? Can you raise your hand if you have either Microsoft Word or Word for Mac? Okay, it would be helpful if you could bring it to the small group. So here again are John Locke's two revolutions which have lasted. You could argue that he's a more effective revolutionary than Lenin, because the Russian Revolution is over, I'm sorry, guys. But this system has largely survived. And not only was he responsible for the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England, he inspired the American Revolution. In fact, they plagiarized some of his words. If you do the same things that Thomas Jefferson did with the Declaration of Independence, you're going to get a very bad grade unless you quote him. Locke wrote, life, liberty, or possessions. The Declaration of Independence says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Glorious Revolution, before the Glorious Revolution, in the section you read, all men are by nature equal. And when Thomas Jefferson wrote the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. When they wrote the Constitution, they put the letter concerning tolerance into the Constitution, and they said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so all around the world, if you were Jewish and persecuted in Russia, people were saying to each other, if you just get to New York, you'll be safe. And around the world, that was largely true, that in countries which had a Lockean perspective on religion, you could be Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, whatever, and you would be safe. Now, I want to say that America was not a perfect democracy right after the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, only a rich minority, maybe the richest 10% of the population, could vote, but the argument that equality comes from God meant that the clock was ticking. And by the 1830s, nearly all of the property qualifications had been abolished. In 1776, slaves could not vote, but the clock was ticking. The argument that equality comes from God meant that slavery had to be abolished, and by 1865 it was. Women did not have the vote in 1776, but the argument that equality comes from God meant that the clock was ticking, and women had to be included. By 1920, women had the vote in the United States. So don't tell me that we shouldn't assign books by dead white men, because John Locke is expressing freedoms that many people around the world in every continent are still crying out for, are still fighting for. He's still asking questions that people are asking of their government. Locke's voice asks today, in the year 2014, who in the world but you should decide your religious faith? Who in the world but you should be able to decide if you should be allowed to try to set up a business? Who in the world but you should decide if you should be allowed to sell that business to support yourself in your old age? Who in the world but you should elect the people who make your laws? So don't tell me we shouldn't study dead white men, because this is one dead white man who is very much still alive.